Hey everyone, so we're continuing where we left off. Yesterday's video was about the Essenes, and what we're doing is we're going beyond the Bible so that we can see different sides of the story that we don't get in the traditional canon. And beyond the Bible is the theme, and the reason we're going beyond the Bible is because when you go by the version of history that was handed to you by the religious and political victors of history, you're only getting the version of that history that they want you to believe. And it's funny how truthers know this. People know this in the truther community. They know that's why the public schools give you certain doctrines or certain teachings in the textbooks. But for some reason, when it comes to the Bible itself, they don't think that that's a reality. They willingly accept whatever the Catholic Church gave us for religious history. So what we're doing in these videos is we're going beyond the Bible to see what other historical writings were around during the first century. And the last video looked at Josephus, who was a Jewish historian during that time, and he gives us a lot of insight about the Essenes. So in this video, we are going to learn about the Ebionites, or at least I'm going to introduce you to the Ebionites. There's a lot to learn about them. This is just introductory. I'm breaking the ice. And so even though the Essenes give us a better understanding of what Yeshua and John the Baptist believed, the Ebionites are a good example of the impact they had on early Jewish believers. So the Essenes existed before the arrival of Yeshua, and they survived until the end of the first century. But the Ebionites, they surfaced after Yeshua's ministry. They were the result of his ministry. So even though the Essenes and Ebionites are two distinct historical groups, they both resemble one another in conviction and lifestyle. And the information that's available about the Ebionites, it primarily comes from two sources. The Panarion, which is a work by Epiphanius, who was he was a rival, or he considered them heretics, okay? And we also have the writings of Clement in Recognitions and Homilies. Those are his two well-known works. So even though Epiphanius considered the Ebionites heretics, his writings provide us with detailed information either way. And what makes him so valuable is that his information is consistent with Clement, who, unlike Epiphanius, Clement did not oppose them. So here's the difference. The Panarion, Epiphanius's work, it was a polemic. And Clement's writings, Recognitions and Homilies, it was more of an effort to recount certain events or religious convictions as accurately as possible. So Epiphanius was more subjective in his disdain for others, but Clement, you can tell he was humble, he's transparent in his writings. And so both of these two men are poles apart in their beliefs, their convictions, their writing style, but it does speak volumes that their information about the Ebionites, it agrees with each other. So the label Ebionite, it might be unfamiliar to a lot of people, but the term Natsarim, that's probably more recognized. And I see references to the Natsarim all the time in the Torah community. A lot of people in Hebrew roots, they identify by that name. But here's the thing, even though it's evident that most people who associate themselves, even though they want to cling on to that historical connection, they're not aware of the most fundamental aspects of that early movement, that they were anti-sacrifice. They rejected temple sacrifice, and they were all vegetarians. So the Natsarim, they were followers of the way. They were closely connected to Yeshua during his ministry. but it was only later that they would be known by the title Ebionites. So when we speak of the Natsarim, we're speaking of the Ebionites, the same sect of Jews who were impacted by Yeshua's ministry. One writer thinks the term Natsarim was used by outsiders, calling them the Natsarim, and the term Ebionite, it was most likely used as a self-identification. Whether that's true, I don't know. That's what he's found. But either way, the Natsarim, they continued the teachings of Messiah after his ascension. And even though people in Hebrew roots assume the Natsarim held to our modern perception of Torah, it's simply not true. And I see this all the time in different theological communities, different denominations of Christianity. People find reassurance of their doctrines by identifying with certain historical groups that resemble their core values or religious beliefs. But the problem is people more often, their desire to find that historical connection, it's stronger than the connection itself. So even though a few statements of doctrine or something might line up, that's all the people do, is they find one or two statements that a certain group believed, just like the church that I came from. It was a Oneness Pentecostal church. They taught modalism, and modalists were a group of people back a long time ago who they identified by modalistic monarchianism. And so the Oneness Pentecostal church believes that their view of the Godhead and Christ was what the church believed in the first century all throughout time, when it wasn't. There's just a group called modalists, a certain group during this time that they identify with. And so that's how it works. People, they find something or a way to identify themselves with people throughout history, and it reassures them that their belief or their theology is the true theology. And like, it's the same with the Natsarim. People understand that the Natsarim were a group of people who followed Yeshua. However, they don't understand that what they truly believed. Okay, Natsarim, it's a familiar term. It often gets thrown around the Torah community, and the modern associations between Hebrew roots and the Natsarim, they're just based on misconceptions about what was actually believed and practiced during the early movement itself. So the Ebionites were basically the fruit of Yeshua's ministry. They lived simple, like Yeshua himself, like the Essenes. And they accepted his role as a prophet who is forespoken about in Deuteronomy chapter 18. They accepted that this is who Deuteronomy 18 was talking about. Okay. They did hold to more of a Unitarian Christology. And for this reason, a lot of people reject the Ebionites, not knowing that they are the Natsarim. And they say, well, the Ebionites are heretics because they don't believe in the incarnation theology and things like that. They believe Jesus was a man separate, apart from God. I'm not going to get into Christology, but the Ebionites did, the Natsarim, they did hold to a more of a Unitarian. It's what that's the designation that we would call it today, is that he was a man approved of God. Like Peter said, Yeshua is a man approved of God. He was anointed by God. Okay, he was a prophet. That's what Yahuwah, that's what he revealed to Moses, is that this future prophet will come from your brethren. He will rise up from your people. He will have the blood of the Israelites. He will be a human according to the blood of the Israelites. This pure bloodline that has a lot to do with it. That's why Yeshua commanded against intermarriage between different nations or people of different blood. He wanted the Messiah to have a pure human bloodline that came straight from Adam and Eve in the garden, that survived all throughout history, that was unaffected by the Nephilim. And so, I mean, this gets a lot deeper, but like I said, I'm not going to go into the Christology. Even though I do believe the Unitarian Christology, as we understand it today, is the most consistent. So, they rejected things like Trinitarianism. It wouldn't have even been around during that time. That was more of a Catholic invention that came a little bit later. But they did believe Jesus was a man approved of God, like Peter said in Acts 2:22. Okay, so the Ebionites, they believed the sonship of Yeshua was made possible not so much by what we know as the virgin birth, but by adoption through obedience. And that's why the New Testament writers speak in terms of adoption. It's a spiritual connection, and regarding our future bodies, our future spiritual state, okay, through obedience. We're not blood brothers, right? But it's hard for a lot of people to consider, but I do think there's a lot more to it. I think there's a lot in the Bible that has been written into the text regarding certain doctrines about Christ and his origins, his divine status, his status as deity, which there's a difference between deity and divinity. A lot of people don't know that. They just assume those words are the same. And like I said, I can get into that later. Anyway, a lot of people would argue that the Ebionite movement only formed after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. But the truth is that Yeshua began the movement, okay? It was the Jesus movement that I was talking about in the last video. So, and here's the reason. It's argued that temple sacrifice was no longer an option, and only after that did early Jewish Christians become vegetarian. It was basically a response to the event of the destruction of the temple. And this is interesting for a reason, because people will have to admit some things that they previously argued against, okay? It's funny because people say, well, they were only vegetarian after the destruction of the temple. Why do you think that? Well, it's because there are some writings from the Talmud. I discussed this in another chapter. One part, and here are I can tell you real quick, the Babylonian Talmud. I have the references in my book. I'm not even exactly sure how to read them. I have the links on in the chapter 8, the section, the Ebionite imprint. It's in the footnote. I have these references, but it says, and now that the temple is not standing and one cannot eat sacrificial meat. Okay, the reason is because many people understood that you were only allowed to eat the flesh of animals under the system of the temple sacrifice. They knew that without a priest or without being in the certain area, you weren't allowed to consume meat. And this is where there's a huge difference between modern Hebrew roots and Torah and versus people back then. They understood, no, you're not allowed to eat the flesh of animals if you don't go through the temple system. And it's just, this is even more proof is that it's in the Talmud. And there's another place where it says, when the temple was destroyed a second time, there was an increase in the number of ascetics among the Jews whose practice was to not eat meat and not drink wine. They said to him, shall we eat meat? from which offerings are sacrificed on the altar. And now that the altar has ceased to exist, he's saying, what are we going to do? Should we continue to eat meat now that it's unlawful for us to do so, since the altar's not there, since the temple's gone? They didn't know what to do. So a lot of people from that time became vegetarians because it wasn't lawful to eat meat after the destruction of the temple. And that's the difference between people today versus Torah observers back then. Those who ate meat and went through the temple system, they understood that that temple system, the Levitical system, the Levite priesthood, the Levites were the only ones allowed to kill animals. Okay? And people understood this back then. Hebrew roots don't understand this today. They'll go to Walmart and buy a chub of meat that's been prepackaged and filled with all kinds of glues that come from pigs and from who knows where else. And they don't even care. They just say, I got beef and it's lawful to eat beef, and so I'm following Torah. No, you're not, because you've neglected that you are eating beef, not even going through the system of the law that you claim to uphold so much, okay? So, like I said, it's true that many Jews did respond to the temple destruction this way. They reevaluated their meat consumption, but it can't account for all Jews, all right? It doesn't mean that Jewish Christians responded this way. It just means now, and when I say Jewish Christians, these are the Torah observant people who followed Yeshua. Okay, the people who followed Yeshua during his ministry, and the Ebionites who were there afterwards, they would have already stopped consuming meat if they did before. Like I said, the Essenes didn't eat meat either way. So just because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD doesn't mean that's the date when people started to become vegetarian. People had already lived to that higher standard of the law, thou shalt not kill. So therefore, they didn't need to follow these other extensions of the law when it came to eating meat, because they didn't do it. They didn't eat meat already. They didn't think God commanded us to eat meat or else we're not in covenant. That's a modern teaching. In modern Hebrew roots, people say that you have to eat meat, the flesh of animals, to be in covenant with God. That's a false teaching. The reason is because people don't understand the culture they were living in. They don't understand the law. People will say today that you don't understand the law if you're not eating meat. Well, I think it's the opposite. People who are eating meat today and using those laws to teach that you have to eat meat, they're doing what the Pharisees did back in the day. Okay? Anyway, let's move on. So, let's see. If some Jewish Christians became vegetarian in response to the destruction of the temple, it can't account for all Jewish Christians. Okay? It's possible that Torah observant Jews from either affiliation, they could have responded to the temple incident in that way. But prior to the destruction of the temple, people were following Yeshua and not eating meat. Okay? That's just the way it was. They were called the Natsarim, the Ebionites. Okay? They were Essenes. These people who had that conviction of compassion towards animals. Okay? The Jesus movement in the beginning was largely against temple sacrifice. They practiced vegetarianism prior to the destruction of the temple. Okay, so as a matter of principle, the Ebionites did not eat the flesh of animals. They rejected temple sacrifice because of their understanding of the Levitical system and regard for creation. Okay, they were sober-minded. They avoided the consumption of alcoholic beverages. They were peacemakers. They condemned war. They placed a heavy emphasis on baptism as an alternative to animal sacrifice. We talked about this in the last episode. They were a lot like the Essenes. Some of them were Essenes who just continued their convictions while accepting Yeshua as the true prophet that Moses forespoke of. Okay? But ultimately, the Ebionites believed Yeshua came to reveal the eternal law, to restore the original Torah as given in the garden. They didn't consider Yeshua's doctrine to be new, as a lot of people misunderstand today. They believed that he reminded the people of the old path, so to speak. And so, it's different because people in the church today, they do think, well, Jesus brought a new teaching. And that's why it caused so much controversy. But it really wasn't. He was really just reiterating the doctrine given at creation, the instructions that were given when humankind was made, when the animals were made. His teachings were authoritative because they were delivered from the Father, consistent with what the Gospels say. And the Gospels aren't shy about that. He brought the commandments of his Father. Okay, so here's the problem. I had a guy recently. Well, he unfriended me because I was talking about the Ebionites one day, and he jumps on social media and he says, "Andy, look, the Ebionites, they didn't believe Jesus was Yahuwah in the flesh, and they don't believe in the virgin birth, so they're heretics." And so here's the thing, whether these doctrines are true or not, that's beside the point. Mainstream sources are always going to mislead you if it doesn't line up with Catholic doctrine and the version of the Bible that you have. They are going to call it heresy if it doesn't line up with the canon. Okay, so when you look up Ebionites on the internet, you're going to find that a lot of people do call them heretics. Okay, most of the time the Ebionites, they're listed under the development of heresy during the 1st century, and that's just because history is written by the victor, both in the secular and religious world. So if you're really interested in learning more of an unbiased account of early Jewish Christianity, like I said, there's recommended resources in the back of my book, and they're not mainstream sources, okay? And I'll even give you just a couple of them right now. Get The Lost Religion of Jesus by Keith Akers. Get Jesus and the Temple, The Crucifixion in its Jewish Context by Simon J. Joseph. Here's one. I mentioned this in video 2. Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman. The Gospel of the Holy 12. That's a lost gospel that was rediscovered. Doesn't line up with a lot of things in the traditional canon, the 4 Gospels that the Catholic Church gave us. And that's a good thing because we need all the information, not just the parts that were given to us by the Catholic Church, because they suppressed a lot of information. The recognitions of Clement and the Clementine homilies, and then even the Essene Gospel of Peace. So there are some good resources where you can find a lot more about the Ebionites or the Natsarim that are not, like the first result you get when you look up the Ebionites. That's what this guy did, who was telling me, I've slipped into bad doctrine. He just, he went on the internet, saw the first, and I know he did because I have seen the words that he used were taken straight from a search result that I found during one of the first times. And he brought up these 2 or 3 points that I remember when I was researching the Ebionites on the internet. You got to sift through them all, but you're going to find that the first few are very biased. It's all censored, and so you're going to know. And that's what he referred to is the top picks for who the Ebionites were. So, and that's just a rule of thumb that you don't do that. You don't go by what the people, Google. All right, people know that when you research something, you got to do better than that. And so it was just evident that this guy didn't do any diligent research. He just clicked on the first thing, found what supported his belief, and he came at me using that. It's kind of like the people who argue against cosmology by searching the internet and finding the first thing you find on the internet and using that as proof to argue against biblical cosmology. I saw a really good debate last night on Take on the World. It was good. If you've never researched biblical cosmology, maybe I'll start talking about that in the future on the channel. For now, it's going to be about biblical veganism, the garden diet. Anyway, part of the reason that the Ebionites are cataloged as heretics is because their disdain for Paul. They were not fans of Paul, and that's okay. They regarded Paul as a self-proclaimed apostle who led his own movement. And, I'm kind of in the middle on Paul, but I do agree with him that he did lead his own movement. He was a self-proclaimed apostle. I don't think he was a false apostle. I think you need to be careful there. I think it's okay to say he was a self-proclaimed apostle. Okay, it's just like anyone today. I look at him like I look at pastors today. They teach whatever they know about the gospel, but they're missing a lot of truths, a lot of details, and they do whatever they can to further the message in ways that might benefit them or their church organization, just like pastors. I don't think he's anyone more special than a pastor today. Okay, he's not like the original 12 who Yeshua chose himself. We'll get into Paul in a future video, but I'm pretty neutral on Paul. I'm not against him. I think he has some good writings. He's got a lot of good insights. And I use a lot of those insights throughout my book. When it came to eating flesh, he was flaky. He did condone it sometimes, and then other times it seems like he condemns it depending on who's around. So anyway, like I said, Paul, before I open up that whole can of worms, my attitude towards him, whether he was a true apostle or not, is that he was an individual with his own thought process. He was someone who sought to do what he thought was best to spread the gospel. And even though we may or may not agree with some of the things he said, the fact is that we all have different interpretations of the gospel. We use our own judgment in certain scenarios. So one of the first rules of thumb, at least for me personally, is to never elevate Paul or anyone above anyone else, as if his writings are more inspired than any other writer during the first century. And that's what people do today. I look at Paul no differently than I look at teachers of the faith today. I said it a minute ago, and that's basically where I stand. He was human. He was like pastors. He was like rabbis today who share their own view of the gospel or Torah, and Paul was no different. Okay, one thing to keep in mind, though, before we move on, when we scrutinize Paul, people have different outlooks and personalities. We're all different, okay? Not one person is the same as the other. And the fact that there are so many churches today demonstrates how different people think. Denominationalism, it's the result of different interpretations of the gospel and different motives of men who lead their congregations in various directions, okay? And it was no different during the first century. Paul, he arrived on the scene much later than the original 12. He formed his own conclusions about the message of Yeshua. He wrote down his thoughts. The only difference is that his letters were accepted and canonized while the Ebionites were silenced. And so this is why we go beyond the Bible, is because the victors chose Paul's writings. You would think that they would choose someone like Clement because Clement was a lot more closely affiliated with the original 12. He was Peter's buddy, and you would think someone who was closer to the original 12 would have been chosen to be canonized, okay? And that's why we look to Clement. But the people who write history, they don't want us to see both sides of the story. And that's why our knowledge of the Ebionites, that's why we have such a fragmentary image or view or idea who they are. It's because it comes only through the writings of Clement and Epiphanius primarily. So the majority vote wins, or at least the majority vote of the people in power. Okay, so when Christianity began to take shape in the mainstream world, the Bible was canonized. By who? Men. Okay, more specifically, men who make decisions favorable to their own beliefs and circumstances. Political agendas, all right? So even though it's true that many facts have been preserved through the transmission of the Bible, we do get a story in the Bible that's true, but it's just as true. It's just as much true that some facts have been omitted, and namely the vegetarian expression of the first century Ebionite community. That's one of the truths that have been suppressed, okay? And that's the reason why our focus should be more on determining whether sacred writ should be our authority, the Bible, the scriptures, okay, when it is the product of man, okay? It's the product of an agenda to conceal the truth about animal sacrifice. And it's not to say that that's the primary agenda, but it was part of a big agenda, one of the main ones, nonetheless, okay? Now, I don't know if I want to get into this, but it is a part of this section. The Jerusalem Council. It's one of the most argued points in the New Testament, and it is worth re-examining in the context of biblical veganism. Okay? Generally, the story is debated between Torah believers and Christians today to determine whether the law was done away with or not, okay? And that's coming from two groups of people where truth is somewhere in the middle, okay? Torah don't have it all right, and neither do Christians, okay? Torah people believe the law in its entirety, every part of the law of Moses, is equally the same, and you have to do all those commands. And that this story of the Jerusalem Council was just their way of saying, no, everything in the law of Moses we should uphold. Whereas Christians, they understand that parts of the law are the product of man. They understand that, animal sacrifice, they understand that it was done away with. Now, the thing is, I don't think Christians fully understand why animal sacrifice was done away with, or that it was invented by man. They likely believe it was God's wishes or something that God wanted, that he wanted people. That's the way I was raised in church, is that God desired that form of worship, to kill animals, spill their blood, and burn them on the altar. It's morbid, but that's what most Christians think. Same with Torah people. But like I said, truth is somewhere in the middle. But if we look from a different angle, okay, we might be able to recognize details of the story that we didn't notice before. If you notice the emphasis they placed on meat restrictions in the story, then you'll find that Torah people and Christians are missing something. It was important enough to be listed as one of the initial requirements for new converts. Okay, and in Acts 15 it says, it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us not to burden you with anything beyond the following requirements. This is for new converts. You are to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from meat strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. You will do well to avoid these things. Okay, so most Torah adherents understand the general idea of the story. There was a Jewish party insisting that Gentile converts must be circumcised as a part of their conversion to attain salvation, okay? The verdict, however, overruled that there were more important issues such as abstaining from food sacrificed to idols, blood, strangled animals, and sexual immorality, okay? And even though it's commonly observed that these instructions were based on the law of Moses, it's more intricate than a simple reference to keep the law. A lot of people in Torah, they just try to say, oh, see, what they were doing was they were saying, keep the whole law. And that's not it at all. They were literally emphasizing more important parts of the law, okay? And most of the time in Torah, we looked at the directive and we just assume, and that's the way I was taught when I came into Torah. I read a few books that, they were basically saying, see, this proves they were still teaching the law of Moses, but they leave it at that. Their focus is more on proving that the apostles kept the law instead of understanding where they were coming from and why they listed these specific instructions. And sure, those instructions are Torah-based. However, aside from sexual immorality, all other sins that they mentioned pertain to consuming animal flesh. It's not just an acknowledgement to the law of Moses, it's an obligation to life before the law of Moses, okay? And that's big, all right? It's an appreciation for the original Torah given in the Garden of Eden, the same directive that was reiterated after the flood of Noah's day, Genesis 9:4. But the flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, you shall not eat. Okay, and a lot of people think, oh, that just means drain the blood, and then you can eat the dead flesh of animal carcass. We can get into that later. I got a video coming up for that. People love quoting Genesis 9:3, and then they ignore Genesis 9:4 and the few verses later where God makes a covenant with all the animals, an everlasting covenant. Do you really think his covenant with the animals was in reference to humans eating them? Is that the covenant? It doesn't make sense. Anyway, the council. Most of the time we reason that the council was just using their best judgment about which laws they felt most crucial at the time for new converts, and to some degree that is accurate, but it fails to capture the depth of the circumstances. It's a good argument for contending against Western Christianity, sure, but it does not address the central issue among the early apostolic discourse. Animal sacrifice was rejected by certain Jewish parties, and this moral outlook was growing among believers of the way during this time. Now, this was the reason for so much disagreement between different parties of Christians during the first century. And, some people might argue that Acts 15, the specific laws that were mentioned pertain to meats offered to idols. Not all meats, just ones sacrificed to idols. And the instructions against strangled meats, that only alludes to certain aspects of Levitical guidelines. You got to remove the blood. You got to drain the blood. So in other words, it would allow the individual to continue eating flesh as long as it was kosher. That's what people read these laws as. Well, they were just telling them to eat the right meats, basically, is how people interpret that. And then the blood, these are the three separate issues. Three distinct facets of food laws were mentioned for three different reasons or three different purposes. So it's assumed that the apostles were simply establishing boundaries for new converts in their meat consumption. So basically they believed that they were saying, oh, you can eat meat as long as you do these things. The problem with that line of thinking is that each directive is a matter of restriction, not allowance. Okay, they were saying do not do. They weren't saying do this. They were saying do not do this. And it's the same concessional agreement that God made with the Israelites in the wilderness. They're basically saying, as long as these people are going to continue eating meat, put these restrictions over them if they can't give it up. And that's what I see when I read Acts chapter 15. It's that the apostles understood the concessional agreement between God and the Israelites, or at least the boundaries that he put over their behavior. All right. But at the same time, I don't have a problem with interpreting this story, under the allowance, just because I think it supports our position even more. If you understand that many of the early Jews believed that meat consumption was permitted only through the Levitical system, if you instruct these Gentile converts to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, they would have eliminated a lot of flesh eating from their diets, okay? In a world where animal sacrifice was the universal language for ancient religion, at the very least, their instructions would have removed most available meat options from those Gentile parties. It would have reduced their meat consumption, okay? So basically, the apostles were, if they were truly allowing the new converts to consume meat, they were reducing their options in the process by establishing those restrictions. They were reiterating the same instructions that God gave to the flesh-hungry Israelites in the wilderness. Doesn't that sound familiar? It should, because it is the same method used to steer the Israelites back in the direction of meat reduction, potentially elimination. If food sacrificed to idols was a big enough problem to have been mentioned several times throughout the New Testament, then we can't discount that an average slaughtering or roast involved a ceremonial rite among the Gentile communities, okay? And for the apostles to respond in this way to Gentile converts would have been similar to how Yahweh responded to the Israelites coming out of Egypt, by significantly reducing their flesh consumption with the intention of eliminating the behavior altogether. Okay? Basically, the Jerusalem Council dealt with the Gentiles the same way Yahweh dealt with Israel in the wilderness. All right? Now, as for the people today who defend their meat consumption under the notion that the scripture endorses that behavior, there are several problems. First, from what I've noticed in the Torah community, the standards for meat, they don't appear to be very high. Our attitude is basically shaped more by the culture and what the food industry has made available to us. And if an animal is deemed clean according to Leviticus 11 or Deuteronomy 14, the average person in Torah doesn't care how the meat makes its way to their plate. They'll go through the drive-thrus. They'll buy from any local store. So even though some people have higher standards than others, I do know a lot of people who say, well, I slaughter my own animals. I have a private butcher who's kosher. Okay, yeah, but most individuals purchase their meat from any local supermarket, as well as they order menu options from whichever fast food chains or restaurants serve their preferred cuisine. So if Acts 15 is believed to be nothing more than a directive to make sure meat is kosher, then, if Acts 15 is what most Torah advocates today say it is, then the average Torah believer today doesn't take that matter seriously, not as seriously as they did in Acts chapter 15. If so, they wouldn't be going through the drive-thrus. They wouldn't be buying their meat at Walmart, And I'll take it a step further and say, Torah believers would have come to, if they took that matter seriously, they would have come together, had a temple built, had a Levitical priesthood in order so that they could lawfully consume their meat. Because according to Mosaic law, it had to be centralized. It could only be done at certain times within a certain area and by the priests. And anything outside of that area was considered bloodshed, and they would have been cut off. That's why you even saw it in the Talmud. That's why people were recognizing it. Well, how can we eat meat now? The temple's been destroyed. after 70 AD. That's why a lot of people became vegetarians. They knew it wasn't lawful to eat flesh outside of the temple, outside of that system, okay? Okay, so another thing is that we got to understand the difference between eating clean and eating kosher, okay? The former refers to the animal itself. Clean is, a cow versus a pig. However, a cow is deemed clean according to Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. But here's the thing, here's the kosher part of it. If the cow didn't go through the proper slaughtering procedure, or he was found dead, or he was strangled to death, or he was tortured in the process, it was not suitable to eat, okay? If the Jerusalem Council was more concerned with making sure that new converts were eating kosher, then they placed a heavy emphasis on those standards above all other moral aspects of the law. I mean, that was the main focus of the council. These three food laws, these three laws pertaining to eating flesh. So Acts 15, it reveals the anti-sacrificial vegetarian ideology of early Jewish Christianity. And it's as if the apostles described flesh eating in as many categories as possible to help the new converts understand the goal. They wanted them to see, hey, we are trying to rehabilitate you from consuming the DNA of animals and down to being more of a plant-based, just like what God designed us to do in the garden. Not just food sacrificed to idols exclusively or animals that were strangled, but anything that has blood flowing through its veins. The life of every living, breathing soul. If it possessed blood, then it was never meant to be consumed. So ultimately, the council's acknowledgement to food sacrificed to idols, that could easily be a blanket statement referring to animals altogether, because that's where the animal sacrifice originated. If the apostles understood that the Levitical system was corrupt, then it's consistent to think that they were encouraging new converts to repent from the dietary practices of the nations. So in that regard, it makes more sense as to why their instructions were so critical. It echoed the teaching of their rabbi. It aligned with Yeshua's endeavor to cleanse the temple of animal sacrifice. And so here's the thing about the circumcision party. I got to talk about this real quick, just because it's part of the Acts 15 story. It says in verse 5, and then later in verse 24, it says, "But there rose up again a certain sect of the Pharisees, which believed, saying it was needful to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses." And then later in verse 24, it says, "For as much as we have heard that certain men which went out from us, they've troubled you with those words, subverting your souls, saying, we must be circumcised and keep the law, to whom we gave no such command." Well, that's good. To whom we gave no such command. If you're not aware of the distinction between the law of Moses, or the scribal law, the law that the scribes invented and added to the scriptures, the Levites, or more specifically, I'm going to be identifying them as the Aaronites, the line of Aaron, those priests. And if you're not aware of the distinction between their law and Yahweh's eternal law, this is not going to mean a thing. But it demonstrates why both Christianity and the Hebrew roots movement have misunderstood certain details about this event. In that passage, we read that the Pharisees were not just pushing circumcision. It wasn't just circumcision. They mentioned this twice. They insisted that the Gentiles should keep the law of Moses. And that's when Peter responded with, well, we gave no such commandment. Why would he say this if the law of Moses was equivalent to eternal law? Okay, and I've heard several arguments in favor of Torah observance. I know people who have written about this in books. But it's another common dispute that I believe Christianity sees more clearly than the Torah community about this statement, okay? When you understand that Mosaic law is a carnal system, it explains why the apostles would respond this way. In their minds, the law could not do what Yeshua accomplished. Peter, who had adopted the Essene lifestyle of vegetarianism, he contended against the Pharisees on this issue. He insisted that it was more about eliminating meat from their diet than following the food laws that the scribes had written into the text, okay? He listened to their demand for others to observe the law of Moses, and he proposed a solution. Stay away from food sacrificed to idols, blood, and strangled animals. So if you understand how central that issue was to the inner circle of the Natsarim, or the Ebionites, it aligns perfectly. It was Peter's way of distinguishing between the traditionally accepted laws versus the law of Yahweh. And Stephen's story, that's similar, okay? It talks about how he was set up, they set up false witnesses against him, saying, this man ceaseth not to speak blasphemous words against this holy place and the law. So his story in Acts chapter 6 is another example of popular ideology misleading people. Today, people focus on that statement about bearing false witness against Stephen and blaspheming against the temple. They'll use that to say the elders and scribes they made up the entire accusation. So basically, Stephen, he apparently didn't say that Yeshua challenged the temple administration, and it was all a part of their false witness against him. But that's not true. If you understand that Yeshua did condemn temple activity and their misguided traditions, their business, Stephen spoke about that, and he was called a blasphemer for the things he was saying. He was saying, yes, Jesus did do this. If he didn't say those things, why would he have been accused in the first place? It only makes sense to see the religious leaders react that way if what he said was true. Yet they considered it blasphemy, which was not true. That's the false witness against him. Or it explains why they set up false witness against him. Okay. The apostles of the first century, they formed a core brotherhood resembling the Ebionites, okay, or the Essenes, who were later called the Ebionites, okay. The New Testament offers just a glimpse of their lifestyle, but it does not offer a complete depiction of that faith community. The recognitions and homilies, they help fill in the gaps. And throughout Shifting the Torah Paradigm, I have cited the recognitions and the homilies in many places throughout that book. You've probably heard me in these videos bringing stuff out from them, okay? The recognitions and homilies, they fill in the gaps along with other historical accounts, the Gospel of the Holy 12. But even with the information that we have in our Bibles, I believe that truth can be seen if we are willing to be more open-minded and admit that some things have been revised to promote an agenda. Okay, but that's it for today. This is the introduction to the Ebionites, and it shows you, even in the Bible, I introduced you to them, and I showed you a few examples in the Bible how the early church responded in that Ebionite mindset to certain situations. So I hope you liked the video. Please give it a like. Please share. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and I will see you next time.